Welcome. Welcome to CEU. Welcome at this workshop on illiberal legacies in Europe. As you know, this workshop is hosted by the Horizon Project, Neo-authoritarianisms in Europe and the Liberal Democratic Response. This project is dominated by sociologists and political scientists. But when we put together the application about 4 years ago, then we decided to differ from similar projects run in the field by giving more historical and philosophical depth to our work. So the workshop is supposed to address many questions, but the ones that I consider most important is about how the debate that took place about 100 years ago in Europe around the issues of liberal democracy, the questioning of liberal democracy differed from the debates that take place today. What were the main focus of those debates, how discontinuities and continuities can be observed across the century in various countries, how the countries differed from each other, and to what extent can we find ideological motives, the role of ideas in shaping political positions. Again, I know that there are many other issues that will be raised, but to me, these are the most crucial ones. Now, when we start thinking about these issues, we need to do a bit of conceptual regulation or policing, so to say, to arrive to somewhat converging or similar ideas about our topic. One of the key terms is illiberalism. And when we thought about this term, we realized that it would be a mistake to think of it as simply rejection of ideas promoted by liberal parties. That would be too narrow. But then we also decided that we shouldn't think of it as objection to democracy. That would be too large in a way, and also like there is a term for that, anti-democracy, that's a perfectly good word. So instead of that, we thought that perhaps we should go for this middle ground and identify illiberalism as attack against some fundamental principles of liberal democracy. There are many such principles that you can think of, but probably most of them can be clustered into three large groups. And these are limitations on power, limited government, neutral state, impartial state, state that is open and inclusive towards various conception of good and various ethnic traditions and so on. And finally, open society, kind of commitment to rational debate, dignity, and openness to influence from outside world. These issues, these attacks against liberal democratic principles manifested themselves differently in different eras and different countries. And this is what the workshop is supposed to address. If you think in terms of differences, you very quickly arrive to the concept of varieties of illiberalism. And here, the most obvious opposition that you can refer to is the difference between populist and elitist rejection of liberal democratic principles. It's very important to remind ourselves that both are possible and both have been practiced in various countries. Nowadays, in political science, the term populism reigns supreme. That is the kind of prevailing term that everybody uses, but it obviously captures only part of the story. And this is something that also came out in our own empirical research. AUTHLIB, the Horizon project you are all involved in one way or another, has completed in summer a survey in 7 countries led by Radek Markowski. And we had many questions addressing various illiberal attitudes, but we also had questions addressing populist attitudes. And what we find is that the two differ, that you cannot unite the two. Actually, the logic of populism and illiberalism are rather different, and there is room to establish other competing logics, or in one way or another questioning aspects of liberal democracy. There is also a possibility to differentiate among varieties of illiberalism in terms of how much religion plays a role, how much religious arguments play a role, how they think about the state, whether they want more state regulation or less, leftist economic policies, right-wing economic policies. You can observe differences in how big role authoritarianism, a hierarchical view of social relations play in these arguments, and so on. I don't want to go through all the varieties, but it's very important to remind ourselves of the wide range of possibilities to questioning liberal democracy, and then to trace these differences back in history. Another issue that we were, and still actually struggling with, is differentiating political aspects of illiberalism from cultural aspects of illiberalism. Nowadays, it's very difficult to avoid paying attention to the cultural aspects. And this is partly because we are supposed to live in the so-called era of culture wars. But another mistake that political scientists often make is that they think that culture wars were invented just now, 10 years ago, while in fact in various forms they have existed back since at least the end of the 19th century. Of course, the topics, the specific issues addressed by these culture wars were different from the topics addressed by these debates today. So it's very important to find out whether the shape of illiberalism depended on what were the specific issues, the specific minorities that were targeted back then, and so on. And finally, we also expect differences from what is today, simply because the challenges of state building and the challenges of nation building were very different at the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century than today. Now, the assumption that all of us have who are in this project is that ideas matter, ideologies matter. This is not the only way to approach politics. There are scholars who assume that all political action, all political activities, at least today, are motivated by simply greed for power and money. And we are not fanatic about this issue. We are ready to admit that it varies to what extent ideas, ideologies play a role. But I think even in the most blatant case of pragmatic politics, if you scratch the surface, you can find some room for ideological interpretation, and you can find the role of historical legacies. Take the most recent example, the victory of Donald Trump in the United States. He is not a politician whom we picture too much time, spending too much time in libraries, reading early 20th century authors and thinking about the philosophical ideas promoted by them. But even his slogan, "Make America Great Again," is a historical slogan. It has been used in American politics before. The agenda that he is promoting is very similar to the agenda promoted by the paleo-conservative authors back in the 1980s and onward. And then if you also look at the vice president, you realize that he is very well embedded in a circle of ideologues and intellectuals who are just like us, partly academics, or at least people who are in the business in terms of interpreting reality through a historical lens. And these ideologues are now very close to power in the perhaps most important office in the world, although that is also changing. And then you have in the MAGA movement people like Steve Bannon, who are on the one hand extremely important operatives. I don't know whether you read this interview with Brexit promoters who admitted that Breitbart News and Steve Bannon himself was extremely influential in getting Brexit done. Nigel Farage said that without Bannon, the Brexit wouldn't have happened. But he's at the same time someone who, so to say, grew up reading Julius Evola and many other esoteric thinkers of the early 20th century, and someone who considers ideologues in opposite corners of the world, like Alexander Dugin, as his comrades who are engaged in getting the same issues on the agenda and changing the world in the very same way. But even if you don't have these very direct links, I think once politicians engage into justifying their action and start to refer to values, they inevitably create a situation when these values start to make a difference because media, because followers start to refer to them. And immediately you have an ideological pattern forming that could be novel, could be innovative, but can also hark back to traditions. So what I very much hope that by the end of today, we will understand a little bit more about the patterns, the configurations that existed about 100 years ago in our countries. We will understand more about the differences. We will see how the different movements, the different angles of questioning liberal democracy prevailed back then. And we can speculate more about whether today's actors and movements can be considered using the same terminology as was used back then, whether it is admissible to use labels like fascist or neo-fascist, or we need to invent new labels, and whether there is some way to analyze current-day political conflicts in a more in-depth way by knowing how these conflicts got resolved or not resolved 100 years ago in our countries. As I mentioned, AUTHLIB is a large-scale project. There are many teams involved, and within the AUTHLIB world, we just think of this workshop as workshop or work package number 8. So there is a number attached. But I think in a way it's an extremely important direction of research, because without anchoring our present day findings in kind of historical narrative, well, we will commit the typical presentist fallacy that political scientists are so prone to commit. And I see that my time is up, so thank you very much.